we'll get to those. So, Robert has a question.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You said a lot of interesting things and make my wheels in my head turn a bit more. I have a question, and maybe listening to what you say, what we need to do in terms of listening to people and your belief that there's two common values in this country we can work off of. I'm looking to what's going on south of the border. And there's a movement there you're aware of, I'm sure, but maybe the people in the audience isn't. It's the so-called philosophy of Ayn Rand, which, if anything, is trying to subvert deliberately all those values. So far, I'm not seeing a major impact of that in Canada. It's a huge impact in the States if you scratch the surface of it. The vice presidents of Canada, the Republicans used to be supported to the correct Catholic Church told them it was immoral. Can you say a few words about that? Do you see it as a threat to our fabric? And if so, what can we do about it? Maybe expand it. What Randiism is about.
In terms of the focus on individualism above all else, is that?
Yeah, and the idea is like charity is moral.
Charity is moral?
Yeah, charity and stuff like that. You know, the what I feel is fundamental philosophical attacks on society as it exists almost anywhere in the world.
It's a simple question. Yeah, that framework and that story of all you are is any success or failure is absolutely the fault of the individual or the benefit of the individual. That's the dominant framework and story that's told in the States. I don't think it has taken hold in the same degree in our country. And I think there's a few reasons for that. We have a different history than the States. I actually think we might have needed each other a lot more, and that's still somewhere in our memory, than perhaps some of the memory in the States. I don't know, not in America. But here's what I can talk to that I think is a cross-cutting value amongst all Canadians, is I think Canadians want to believe that our country is fair. I think Canadians want to believe that decisions that are made in their interest are fair ones. And I do think that when people feel like what's happening is unfair, that, unfortunately, it can take a lot to rile us up and get us onto our feet. But I think that when Canadians feel like, it's taken us a long time to embrace that what happened to Aboriginal peoples in the country was more than unfair. It was fundamentally unjust. But I do think that fairness is a commonly held Canadian value. And I think there's something there for us to think about. I also think that Canadians still believe in, regardless of attempts to convince most of us otherwise, that there is value in us taking care of each other. That there's actually merit in that. 2 days ago at home, there was a debate on the richness of public pensions in BC for public sector workers. I mean both people who were debating either side. One's a colleague. What was most interesting for me was the comments the next day from folks who called in. They weren't what I expected. 90% of the calls were from people who said, I don't actually think that a public servant having an okay pension is the issue. The issue is that almost everyone I know doesn't have a pension. I'm not going to benefit from pulling an adequate pension away from someone in my community because I don't have one. The real conversation is how do we build economic stability for all of our seniors? And that for me was interesting because I haven't heard it framed that way in BC for a while. And I think the reason I'm going on about this is I think it's really important for us to be listening to the kinds of stories that are being told in our communities and to figure out ways where we can tell the story of the work we're trying to do in a way that people see themselves reflected in. Does that make sense? And so I come from the West, and I also want to be clear. In this country, when they talk about the West, that actually stops at the Rockies. Right? There are 3 Wests in Canada. There's Alberta, there's Saskatchewan and Manitoba, which have more similarities than differences, I would offer. And then there's my province, BC, which is it's very special and magical place, and an insane place. But there are actually 3 Wests in the country, and I think it's useful for us to remember that. I can talk about this diagram, which was actually, I wanted to highlight based on what one of you was talking about earlier. This is our model and approach to leadership development. There's 2 models up here, they're very self-explanatory. The top one is a leadership model that is designed to fail. All elements of control and power and information come back to that central dot. If anything happens to that central dot, the system is not resilient enough to withstand itself and to continue and to grow. The dot on the bottom, although there is a central starting point, the goal of the dot in a leadership-rich situation is to work with a small circle of dots to build their capacity so that that small circle of dots can build the capacity of another small circle of dots, etc., 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 until at one point the dot in the middle can be pulled away and disappear, and it doesn't matter. The system is resilient and strong enough so that it will perpetuate itself. And I want to say this, the interesting thing for me about the conservative movement right now is that I actually think it relies on a couple of very strong central dots. And no dot can hold forever. And it's not that I'm sitting around waiting for a dot to disappear, but it's interesting to think about in terms of my approach to leadership, has to be on the bottom so that it's not reliant on one person, so that it's actually reliant on many.
I have a question. So, if we're to go to train each other and to be trained on starting our own movement, our own campaign, and we have a couple of unique circumstances. One is that our membership have to sign up. We don't have to go and get them yet. That might be coming, but so in terms of building, we have the membership, and in terms of going out, we're about to go back out after we do this. We'll be back in the workplace. We go there every day. And in terms of listening, we get to do that a fair bit. Unfortunately, a lot of the people that we listen to are very hostile towards, like you're saying, about our pension, about our job security, about whatever they think of our work ethic, etc., etc. They're often a minority, but they're very vocal. So when you're engaging with these people, which is what this campaign is about, is member engagement and communication, how do you deal with the hostility?
Is the question, is the hostility from the public or from membership?
Well, sometimes. There's the hostility from the public towards the public service, that they think that we're lazy, that we're overpaid, and gold-plated pension plans, that we're underworked. And then in terms of the membership and us as stewards, they often come to us thinking that we're just at a big fancy, fun-filled, action-packed adventure weekend at the casino, that we're not helping them enough, that we're, whatever it is, it's not enough. And that there's deficiencies in the way we do it, and that as stewards we're wasting their union dues as much as the taxpayers, as we're wasting their tax dollars as public servants. So the hostility is from both. Like I said, it's the minority.
It's
The vocal minority.
the vocal minority. Okay. So I have 2 thoughts. One is I think there's different approaches and different stories to tell. The story to talk about to the public, I think, might be a different one than the one that's internal. Because I do think there's ways, I don't want to be Pollyanna, because again, I don't think there's silver bullets. But I do think there's ways to tell the story of the work that your members do that the Federal Civil Service does. Okay, and I know not all the analogies I used earlier, water, etc., are all things that your members would be directly involved in. But there are things that people count on that we only occasionally hear the voice of at the federal level. What I mean by that is when there's an E. coli scare, that's when we start to hear the voice, publicly anyways, of people who meet inspection center, right? It's usually when things go wrong that we start to hear voices from people that are in those areas telling a different kind of story. Now, I think there's use in looking at what is the story of the Federal Civil Service in terms of its background function that allows so many of us to do what we do and get around our country in the way that we do and communicate with each other in the way that we do. In a way that's not about, hey, aren't we just amazing and awesome? Because that sounds self-serving, right? And people aren't going to buy it. But I do think there's a way to tell the story of the public good of the public service. And that's why I say there's two different stories. The conversation internally, from a strategic perspective, if I was in this situation, first of all, I look for the champions. I try to figure out who are the champions in the structure that I'm working with, who, even though they may not be on side with me, I might be able to bring on side if I can figure out how to connect with them. And partly why I do that for me, it's a bit of a wedge strategy. If I can start to identify a few champions that I think I might be able to spend some more time with, then it's partly about inserting a new, trying to, over the long term, insert a new, a bit of a new dialogue or a new possibility into that particular place about what it is that we do. Because negativity can be a hard thing to break, a really hard thing to break. And so I actually think for me, that is about the individual relationships. It's also a part of it is about me figuring out when I can give a little. I know when I'm being yelled at, my response I have a very visceral response. It usually involves a particular finger in the air, right? And a particular reaction to someone who's being hostile to me. But I've learned that in a debate situation, if once someone is finished, I go, you've got a point. And I agree with you here. Here's how I'm trying to tackle this, or I'm trying to address it. It may not fully answer the question, but I do think this is a truism, and I think it's part of the backlash that a lot of us feel in a lot of ways. I think most people don't feel heard or listened to, which is kind of ironic in the age of social media. But that's a different thing, slightly narcissistic. But I think a lot of people don't feel as if what they have to say, that anyone actually really cares. And if there's ways to build a bit of that in, so that you start to look and sound like the reasonable voice, then what I often see happens is the most vocal, hostile voice can eventually start to isolate itself. Because other people can see that accommodation is trying to be made, that you're trying to find a middle ground. Some people, it's like, there's a spectrum of engagement. You can divide the population into 10% deciles, right? Roughly 2 to 3 of those deciles, I could sit before them and turn water into wine and loaves into fishes, and they are not ever going to agree with me. 3%, 3 of those deciles, they're in the church, they're in the choir, I don't have to convince them. My focus has to be on the other deciles within that spectrum. And my goal is to eventually, over time, find ways to move people who are, say, in decile 4 to decile 3, in decile 5 to decile 4. Decile 9 and 10, I'm never going to focus on, because I'm never, ever going to be able to convince them. And I've started to figure out that's not actually my job, to convince them.
Hi there. How you doing? Oh, I don't think I have a microphone.
No, there's no mic.
I'll talk about, there we go.
There's a mic.
I just came from, earlier this week I did I co-facilitated with a manager, a union management approach seminar. What was very interesting is the perspective of the managers in the room were that basically the union wasn't that useful, we all got good pay, we're simply obstructing the ability to progress. I look at history of unions in Canada and I'm thinking more about manufacturing, forestry, labor, and I think most of our members have never been in the union, so I work in IT, members of my particular group are auditors as well as accountants, computer people. Does our approach need to change? I like your talk about story. Does our story, our narrative need to change a little bit as to why we're there, what we do, or even across the whole union?
My personal opinion is yes. And I see examples of that, and I see energy put into trying to reframe the story. I actually think what's happening with Unifor right now, for me, is a very interesting example of a reframing of, a manufacturing-based union and sort of also manufacturing, but coming out of print and telecommunications, of The model, and I know it's a different construct than yours, the model that they're looking at of individuals being able to come in, being able to sign up, almost like the old IWW, the old wobbly model, of you could be a wobbly wherever you were, right? International Workers of the World. There's a similarity in what Unifor is trying to do. I do think that there's a new way to tell the story of unions. There's the historical one, which most people will always say, there was a time and a place for unions, right? That's something I very often hear. There's usefulness in understanding what unions have given us in terms of a 40-hour work week and so many other things. And there's also, and this is why my work with young people, for me, is so important, is that an understanding of the reality of people coming into the workforce now. You know, CLC and some others have done surveys in the last couple of years. You've probably seen the results. The segment of the Canadian population that is most willing to join a union are young people. But they're not in situations where for them that's an option because of the instability of their work or where they're working, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how to crack those nuts, but I do think there's value in experimentation, and that's why I'm excited about what Unifor's talking about, what they want to do and where they want to go. You know, the reality of your situation, I can't speak to in detail because I don't spend a lot of time in it. I also work as a sustainability planner for the Vancouver School Board. And we have very clear structures of power and work within that particular institution, which for me are a constant challenge of figuring out how to navigate and balance. And I can be honest that I get it wrong as much as I get it right. But I do know, I still come back to my key lessons have been about trying to find a champion who feels similarly to work, has a similar outcome to what I'm trying to see in the work that I'm trying to get done. And then I actually do try to spend time with them one-on-one to see where there might be common ground in terms of process and practice. I don't know if that's possible in your situation. And again, I can only speak for my situation, so it may not be helpful at all. But to come back to the role of story, absolutely. You know, some of you might have been at a CLC event recently in Toronto, and the head of the Australian